The crisp autumn breeze was swept away by the approaching storm that was building over on the western side of the valley. It was late in the afternoon, and as the dark clouds thickened, Ethan Travis Baylor flipped up the collar of his flannel shirt to block the chill. "Good thing I grabbed this shirt," Ethan muttered to himself as the wind picked up. "Those clouds are about to make it even colder. Could even see snow before morning." His heavy flannel shirt, almost thick enough to pass for a jacket, was a muted green and brown plaid. It wasn't camouflage, but it blended well enough with the woods around him, and the water-resistant material kept him dry. He was heading back after a disappointing bow hunting trip. Ethan was a man who thrived on hunting, fishing, and anything that got him out in nature, particularly in the woods or near the streams on his own land. He enjoyed the challenge of tracking, knowing it took real skill to come home with a successful catch. While he appreciated the meat and fish he gathered from the wild, he had a personal rule about using firearms. To him, relying on a rifle felt like taking the easy way out. Anyone can sit 200 or 300 yards away with a high-powered rifle, pull the trigger, and call themselves a hunter, he would often say to those who favored guns. But try sneaking within 30 or 40 yards with a bow and landing your shot. That's where real skill comes in, it gives the animal a fair fight. Ethan's land, nestled in Missouri's Ozarks, had been in his family for over 80 years. The sprawling 960-acre property was a mix of wooded hills, a few small streams, one large lake, and some open grassy meadows. As he moved through the trees and brush, Ethan was as quiet as a mountain lion stalking prey, a skill learned from his father and grandfather. His 6'2" frame, lean and agile, moved effortlessly through the terrain. His dark hair and eyes, along with a naturally sun-kissed complexion deepened by years outdoors, were a testament to his Native American heritage, a link that perhaps explained his deep connection to using a bow. Ethan smiled to himself as he neared the old farmhouse, thinking about the family stories of how this land had come into their possession. "This place feels like an old friend, more than just home," he thought, "way more than that apartment in St. Louis ever could." His great-great-grandparents had left the harsh West Texas plains in 1935 during the Great Depression, heading north and east, eventually settling in the Ozarks. Times had been rough in Texas, likely worse than most places, no jobs and a crippling drought that made farming nearly impossible. They chose to settle in these hills, where folks weren't too concerned about the fact that Ethan's great-great-grandmother and grandmother were full-blooded Osage Indians from a reservation in Oklahoma. The Baylors quickly built a homestead and got to work creating a life. Ethan's great-great-grandfather, Henry Baylor, did whatever was necessary to keep his family fed. He knew he needed some cash if he was going to approach the bank that technically owned the land they were squatting on. His plan was simple: if he could scrape together a decent down payment, he figured the bank might sell him the land on credit, considering the times. Henry was determined that once he had legal ownership, he'd be able to turn the farm into something that could sustain them. Back then, there were wild cattle roaming the hills, animals that once belonged to ranchers who had packed up and left or simply let the cattle go because they couldn't afford to feed them through the winter. Henry began gathering up some of these half-wild cattle, not to sell, but as a source of food for his family. He also started running trap lines for fur and pelts, timing it perfectly. He'd start late in the fall when the animals had grown thick winter coats and stop just before spring when they shed those heavy furs. Money was always tight, but the general store would offer credit in exchange for coyote, beaver, muskrat, and marten pelts. Occasionally, Henry even managed to get some hard cash. Another source of income for the Baylors came from the moonshine Henry brewed. He had a homemade still tucked away in a hollow, and the shine he produced was top-notch, highly sought after by the locals. Although Prohibition had ended 2 years prior, the folks living in the hills couldn't, or more likely, wouldn't, pay the higher prices for store-bought liquor. Legal distilleries had to charge more because of taxes, and most of the hill folk had no love for the government or their agents, the so-called G-men. There had been more than a few skirmishes between revenue officers and the stubborn moonshiners in the valleys and hollows of the Missouri hills. The untaxed, illegal white lightning provided a cheaper, more appreciated option for the people in these parts. After a year and a half of hard work, Henry managed to scrape together a little over $400, a hefty sum for those days. With that money, he set out on a 2-day, 50-mile wagon trip to the small town of Vannon to purchase the land and pick up some much-needed supplies. Vannon, with a population of no more than 400, was the county seat of Carter County. Henry's destination was the bank, where he needed to meet with David Barkley, the landowner and banker. "The land you're looking at is worth more than the $2,000 you're offering, Mr. Baylor," Barkley said after hearing Henry's offer. "Why should I take less than its value?" Henry nodded. "You're right, sir. The farm's likely worth more, but not in times like these. This depression the government talks about ain't going anywhere soon. How much is the land making you right now?" "I'm offering you $30 a month, every month, until the loan and interest are paid. Seems to me it's a question of taking what's in hand versus waiting for something that might never come." Henry could see Barkley mulling it over. "And think about this, Mr. Barkley," Henry continued, "if I pay for a few months and then I can't make the payments anymore, you take the land back. At least you'll have gotten something out of it rather than letting it sit there, making you nothing." Henry held up the $400, sealing his argument. Barkley reassessed his initial impression of Henry, realizing he wasn't just an uneducated hillbilly. The man made sense, Barkley thought to himself. "I don't see this depression ending anytime soon, no matter what the government says." After a moment of silence, he spoke up. "All right, Mr. Baylor, we have a deal," Barkley said, extending his hand to take the cash. "Let me just take your down payment to the vault." Henry smiled, but before handing over the money, he added, "I'd like a piece of paper that spells out the terms of our agreement, and I'll need a receipt for this $400. Barkley was impressed. "This man isn't a fool," he thought to himself. He took out a sheet of foolscap and handwrote 2 copies of the mortgage terms, including penalties for default. After getting both signed, he handed Henry his copy. "Well, Mr. Baylor, it looks like you've bought yourself a farm." "Reckon I have," Henry replied with a nod. "I'll be back next month with your payment." Henry left the bank, picked up supplies at the General Mercantile, loaded up the wagon, and rode back to the farm, traveling through most of the night. The land, which spanned a section and a half, had been passed down from father to son over the generations. Ethan inherited the farm from his father, Travis, 5 years ago, at the age of 27. His parents were killed by a drunk driver, and the property had been willed to Ethan. Travis Baylor had used the place mostly as a hobby farm. He'd modernized the property, bringing in electricity and running water from the well into the farmhouse. Travis and his wife enjoyed doing some gardening, but for the most part, the farmhouse and the land served as a peaceful retreat from the busy life in the city. The fields and a few valleys were leased out to a local farmer for some extra income. When Ethan took over, he decided to make a change. He gave the farmer notice that the lease would run for the current season and one more, but after that, it wouldn't be renewed. Ethan had made significant upgrades to the old farmhouse, renovated the barn, and transformed the property into something like a private hunting and fishing retreat. As he topped a small rise, he gazed down at his cabin nestled at the tree line of a narrow valley. A light mist, blown by the wind, had begun to fall, and in the fading daylight, the warm glow from the 2 rear windows of the cabin shone invitingly in the growing dusk. A thin trail of smoke curled up from the Riverstone chimney. Ethan's smile broadened into a full grin. Samantha must have got the fire going, he thought to himself. Bet she's got something cooking on the stove too. Sure hope so, 'cause I'm starving after that hike. Before heading down the slope, Ethan took a moment to appreciate the view of the 2 valleys split by the hill he was standing on. A deep sense of being home washed over him. He worked in St. Louis, but his heart was here, on this old farm, his true home. Grinning even wider, Ethan started down the gentle slope, his thoughts drifting back to how he'd met Samantha. It was at an outdoor sports expo, one Friday afternoon, where he'd gone to check out some new archery and fishing gear. Samantha had been working a booth, promoting a resort for outdoor enthusiasts. He had noticed her right away. Samantha Bod, he read aloud from her name tag, smiling up at her. His interest wasn't in the resort she was advertising, his farm was all the resort he needed. What caught his attention was the girl herself. He wanted to know more about her. "Yes, sir," she said with a bright smile, shaking his hand. "And you are?" Ethan chuckled, realizing he'd forgotten to introduce himself. "Sorry, I'm Ethan Baylor, just Ethan to my friends." "Well, let me tell you about Lost Creek Resort," she said, launching into her presentation, full of energy and enthusiasm. Lost Creek is located on the shores of Greer's Ferry Lake. We've got over 3 miles of shoreline. The resort's in Arkansas, about 2 hours north and a little east of Little Rock, and 2 hours west of Jonesboro. From St. Louis, it's a little over 5 hours south and slightly west. Ethan wasn't fully tuned into what she was saying, he was far more interested in watching her. She's tall, he thought. Must be around 5'9" or 5'10". Samantha was slender but athletic, with long auburn hair and big brown eyes. You'd call her more handsome than pretty, he continued in his thoughts, but in all the best ways. Altogether, a very appealing package. Samantha went on with her practiced sales pitch, her voice full of passion. Lost Creek has 1,000 acres filled with wildlife, deer, elk, turkey, and more. There are miles of hiking trails, float trips on the White River by canoe, kayak, or inflatable raft, plus guided fishing tours on the lake. She gave the speech with polish, but her natural excitement about the place shone through. As she spoke, Samantha couldn't help but find herself drawn to the ruggedly handsome man in front of her. He looks like someone who spends more time outdoors than behind a desk, she thought. Not wanting the conversation to end, Samantha handed Ethan a glossy brochure packed with photos of the resort. "There's a 20% discount voucher in there," she said, hoping to hold his interest a little longer. Ethan took a quick glance at the brochure before handing it back to her. "Miss Bod," he started, but she cut in with a playful correction. "Samantha," she smiled. "My friends call me Samantha." Ethan grinned. "Samantha, then. To be honest, I'm not really looking for a place to visit." "Why not?" she asked, tilting her head in curiosity. "I've got my own little piece of paradise in the Ozarks, just outside Van Buren," he explained. "Nearly 1,000 acres, with plenty of elk, deer, and turkey too. Got a black bear and her 2 cubs living in a cave over on the far side of the property. There's a few year-round creeks and streams, and a good-sized lake as well." With a grin, Ethan added, "You'll have to let me show you around sometime." Samantha returned his smile, but with a hint of teasing. "I'd need to know you a whole lot better before I wander off into the middle of nowhere with you." Ethan chuckled. "Well, we can fix that. The expo wraps up on Sunday. How about dinner on Monday evening? We can kick off the getting-to-know-you process." "Why wait?" Samantha countered. "I'm off at 5 today. The sooner we start, the sooner we can finish, and the sooner I get to check out this resort of yours." Still smiling, Ethan replied, "5 it is, then." That dinner turned into more, and soon enough, Samantha and Ethan were seeing each other at least twice a week, more often when she wasn't tied up with work at an outdoor or travel expo. As time went on, Ethan realized that Samantha was much more than just a pretty face promoting Lost Creek. She had grown up on a farm outside of Columbia, Missouri, and held both a master's degree in business administration and a bachelor's in hospitality management. Her dream was to eventually manage a group of resorts like the one she worked for. Almost exactly 3 months after they first met, Samantha finally got a chance to visit what she liked to call Ethan's resort, for the first time. Though Ethan had brought the house up to modern standards, he had kept a lot of its historical charm. The farmhouse was a sprawling, one-story structure that looked like something you'd expect to find on the West Texas plains. There were two separate sections, connected by a covered breezeway. Ethan had enclosed the walkway with walls and windows so that you could move between the parts of the house without having to face bad weather. On the far side of the breezeway was the master suite, along with two other bedrooms and a guest bathroom. Although Ethan didn't often have company, he wanted to make sure anyone who visited the farm was comfortable. He had renovated the bathrooms and upgraded the plumbing, even having a second well dug to ensure the house had plenty of fresh water. But he kept the old-fashioned pump in the kitchen as a nod to the past. The main house faced west, offering a perfect view of the sunset from the large front porch, where two old rocking chairs sat waiting. Around back, there was another porch, complete with a pair of matching chairs, perfect for watching the sunrise over the eastern hills. The central section of the house was essentially one huge open room. It held a nearly gourmet-level kitchen, a spacious dining area with the original farm table still in place, and a large living room-like space at the front. There was even a bathroom tucked against one of the side walls. Samantha quickly fell in love with the old farmhouse, as well as the picturesque valley it sat in. The story of how Ethan's family had acquired the farm captivated her, and she wasted no time proving she was as comfortable in the woods as Ethan was, sharing his passion for the outdoors. With her hair pulled back in a ponytail and only a little makeup, she blended right in with the hunting party. Together, they would plan which expos Lost Creek Resort and a few other vacation spots would attend. And if Samantha wasn't working, Ethan would pick her up after his own workweek, and they'd head out of the city. The drive to the farm took about 4 hours, with the last hour spent navigating the backroads, forest access trails, and an old two-rut path leading to the house. In the first week of November, Ethan and Samantha headed to the farm again. The deer archery season had just one more week left, and Ethan was determined to harvest a buck. Their busy work schedules had kept them from making it out earlier in the season. After they arrived, Ethan carried in firewood for the stove while Samantha put away the supplies they had brought along. They planned to stay for 4 or 5 days. "If I manage to get a deer in the first day or two," Ethan told Samantha, "we can spend the rest of the time fishing, hiking, or just enjoying some peace and quiet away from the city." Samantha raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a playful smile. "Is there any doubt you'll get a deer?" Samantha pretended to be shocked by the idea and asked, "Are you doubting yourself?" Ethan picked up his bow and replied with a grin, "Using this instead of a rifle gives the animal more than a fair shot." Samantha giggled, then dashed across the room, leaping into Ethan's lap. "Well, you're smart enough to make me fall in love with you, and that's more than good enough for me." Ethan chuckled and pulled her closer. "That's right, and I love you too," he said. Then, reaching into the pocket of his jean jacket, he pulled out a small ring box and held it up for her to see. "Will you marry me, darlin'?" Samantha's response was an excited squeal, followed by a kiss that lingered on Ethan's lips. Hours passed before they remembered they hadn't even eaten dinner. As they got ready for bed after a shower, Ethan said, "I'm heading out before dawn tomorrow. Going to see if I can get a deer near that big rock shelf over in the next valley. I might be back by late afternoon, or close to dusk, depending on how things go. If I get lucky early, I'll come back sooner." The next morning, as Ethan hiked back from his hunting spot, his thoughts drifted to Samantha. But a sudden downpour snapped him back to reality as the skies opened up. "Better get inside," he muttered to himself, noticing the abrupt change in weather. He stepped onto the back porch, taking shelter from the heavy rain. Grabbing a soft, dry towel from a peg on the wall, Ethan wiped down his bow and leather quiver. He had made the quiver himself from elk hide, and it held a dozen broadhead-tipped arrows for big game. His recurve bow was custom-made by Black Widow bows, out of Nixa, Missouri. After months of precise measurements and testing, it had been crafted to meet his exact standards. Ethan hung his bow and quiver on pegs along the back wall, letting them adjust to the room's warmth. He unbuckled his leather belt, which held a small hunting pouch and knife, and hung it up as well. After scraping the mud off his boots, he stepped inside. The moment he entered, Ethan noticed something was wrong. Samantha sat at the kitchen table, her head down, with her hair covering her face. But when she lifted her head, he saw it, a bright red handprint across her cheek. Ethan barely had time to react before noticing the 4 armed men standing by the door. The biggest of them, a hulking man with a .45 pistol, had it aimed squarely at Ethan. "That's far enough, pal," the man with the gun ordered, motioning with it toward the table. "Take a seat next to the lady." Ethan, heart racing, moved over and sat down beside Samantha, quickly checking to make sure she wasn't injured beyond the slap. "There's no money worth taking in the house," he said in a calm, measured voice. "The keys to my truck are in it. Take the truck and supplies, and leave us alone." The big man smiled coldly and shook his head. "You're not getting the picture, buddy," he said. Then, gesturing to the others, he introduced them. "That's Tom, Frank, and Mason, and me. I'm Mason too. Together, we're your worst nightmare." Ethan quickly assessed each man. Tom was gaunt, almost skeletal, with snow-white hair. Frank, though shorter, was built like a brick wall. The other Mason had a wild, unhinged look in his eyes, while the leader, towering over the rest at 6'4", oozed cruelty despite the fake friendliness in his tone. "So what do you want?" Ethan asked, mind racing as he thought of how to protect Samantha. Mason, the leader, smirked. "Ever read a short story called The Most Dangerous Game?" Ethan nodded, while Samantha remained silent. "It's about a rich guy who hunts humans on his private island," Mason explained, a sinister gleam in his eyes. "I've hunted every big game animal across the US, Canada, Alaska, you name it. But I got bored. After reading that story, I decided to try something new, hunting people. And you too? You're my next challenge." "Why us?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his mind was racing. Mason leaned in slightly, still smiling. "Back in August, I was scouting a hunting spot near Fremont. When I stopped by the courthouse in Van Buren for a deer tag, I overheard you talking with the service station owner about your property. Said it was perfect, out in the middle of nowhere. That caught my attention, so I did a little digging." Mason's grin widened, filled with malice. "And here we are. Your farm is 50 miles from the nearest town, and it's posted as no trespassing. I figured this would be the perfect out-of-the-way spot to try my little experiment. After this hunt, assuming it goes well, I think we'll keep using this place. We'll find more people and bring them here for more entertainment." Ethan, keeping his voice steady, offered, "That story ends with the hunter becoming the hunted and losing his life." Mason sneered. "Yeah, that's how the story ends, but this isn't some book. This is real life, and that's not how it's going to go down." "The story was about one man hunting another," Ethan said, nodding toward the other men. "What about them?" "I wanted to share the thrill with my friends," Mason replied with a twisted smile. "Tomorrow morning at dawn, you'll get a 1-hour head start. Then we'll come for you." Ethan's face hardened. "And Samantha?" Mason's eyes flicked over to Samantha, a sick grin forming on his face. "She'll be the prize for whoever takes you down," he said, leering at her. "Though I sure hope I'm the one to win." He laughed, adding, "Of course, if I do win, I'll be generous and share my trophy with the others. I expect they'd do the same for me." Ethan's frown deepened, but before he could react, Mason aimed the pistol at him and Samantha. "None of that," Mason snapped. "You two, over on the couch. Tom, tie them up. Not too tight though. We want our prey to have full use of his hands and feet by morning." He smiled again, an unsettling, cold look. "After all, we're trying to be sporting about it." Tom, the gaunt, skeletal man, pulled out a length of nylon rope, the kind climbers use, and tied Ethan first, then Samantha. His knots were firm but not cutting off circulation. I suggest you get some rest, Mason said, his voice dripping with mock concern. The hunt begins at dawn. Ethan, his voice laced with sarcasm, asked, will the prey at least get a weapon? Mason chuckled, shaking his head. Oh no, I can't risk one of us getting hurt if you happen to get lucky. You'll be unarmed. With that, Mason, Tom, and the other Mason left through the breezeway, heading toward the bedrooms, leaving Frank behind to stand guard. Ethan and Samantha kept their voices low, talking in whispers whenever Frank seemed distracted or stepped out to use the bathroom. They ran through what few options they had, still awake 4 hours later when Tom came to relieve Frank. Tom poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, giving Ethan a brief opportunity to lean in close to Samantha. He whispered, no matter what, I'm coming back for you. Samantha met his eyes and smiled softly, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered back, I know you will. She kissed him gently. Just don't get yourself killed. They're not good enough to catch me, Ethan assured her, his voice full of quiet resolve. You do whatever you need to stay safe, and I'll find you. Samantha nodded, seeming to draw strength from his words. But the dawn came too soon for both of them. Ethan could see the first light creeping in as the sun began to rise. Mason, Tom, and Frank gathered in the kitchen, grabbing coffee. Mason, ever the smug leader, drew his pistol and sent Tom to untie Ethan. Let him stretch his legs a bit before we send him on his way, he ordered. They allowed Ethan to drink his fill of water before roughly shoving him toward the back door. You'll get a 1-hour head start, Mason said, grinning. We won't watch where you go, but in an hour, we'll come after you. Ethan opened his mouth to say something, but Mason raised his hand, cutting him off. Time starts now. You've got 59 minutes. Ethan locked eyes with Mason for a few seconds before turning and stepping out onto the back porch. The door slammed shut behind him with a loud thud, Mason's grim smile lingering in his mind. Ethan wasted no time. He grabbed his bow, quiver, and hunting belt from the pegs on the back wall. Good thing they didn't bother to check back here, he thought, taking off from the yard at a swift, ground-eating pace. 10 minutes later, Ethan had tucked himself behind a massive oak tree on a hill overlooking the valley and the house below. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but the low, dark clouds had begun releasing a gentle snowfall about half an hour after he'd been forced out of the house. From his vantage point, he spotted Mason, Frank, and the other Mason stepping out onto the back porch. The leader pointed toward the path leading up the nearest hill, and the 3 men headed into the woods. So much for a sporting hour head start, Ethan thought grimly. He knew if the snow started coming down harder, it would make it difficult not to leave tracks they could easily follow. He watched as they disappeared over the crest of the hill, heading down the other side. Ethan pulled the ties tighter on his winter moccasins, which allowed him to move quietly through the forest. He waited a few more minutes, ensuring the coast was clear before making his next move. He'd only seen 3 of the hunters, Tom must have been left behind to watch over Samantha, Ethan figured. With careful, deliberate steps, Ethan made his way down the hill toward the back of the house. Taking a quick glance through one of the windows, he spotted Tom at the kitchen table, facing the front door, his head down, focused on a game of solitaire. Samantha was still tied up on the couch, her eyes fixed on Tom, but she looked tense, ready. Suddenly, she swung her legs off the couch and charged at Tom. Ethan watched as Tom snatched up a pistol from the table and backhanded Samantha hard, sending her crashing to the floor. Tom pointed the gun at her head, yelling. Ethan quickly knocked an arrow, creeping toward the door. He was confident he could get a shot off before Tom even realized what was happening. But just as he reached for the door, he heard one of the men coming back down the trail, shouting that he was going to grab the binoculars. Before Ethan could react, a rifle shot rang out, and the bullet slammed into the back wall, inches from his head. The crack of the gunshot followed immediately. Tom spun around, pistol raised toward the door, and Ethan knew his advantage was gone. He bolted, sprinting toward the trees near the corner of the house, putting distance between himself and Frank, who was coming down the hill. Tom rushed outside and fired a couple of shots in Ethan's direction, but Ethan was already deep into the woods. Ethan knew he could have taken out one of them, but dealing with both was another story. If he had burst through the door and taken down Tom, Frank would still be there, along with the rest of them closing in. It would turn into a standoff, with him and Samantha trapped inside the cabin. If he took down Frank first, Tom would have had enough time to shoot him or, worse, harm Samantha. Even in the best-case scenario, where he took both of them out, they'd still have to run, and Samantha wouldn't be able to keep up with him in the long term. They'd end up captured. Ethan clenched his fists, swearing to himself, there will be another time. Mason and the other Mason came down the hill, meeting Frank and Tom on the porch. What happened? Mason asked, his voice tight with irritation. Tom and Frank took turns explaining how Ethan had shown up at the cabin. Looks like he's trying to be clever, Mason said with a sneer. All right, tie the girl up tight and stay sharp, Tom. The rest of us will keep hunting. He pointed toward the woods where Ethan had disappeared and began giving orders. Mason, circle around from the right. Frank, take the left. I'll head straight up the middle. Stay sharp, and we'll catch him in between us. If you corner him, fire 2 quick shots. The others will come to you. Mason and Frank nodded, immediately heading back into the woods. After a minute, the leader Mason followed behind, his rifle at the ready. He assumed Ethan would be running now, trying to escape. But Mason was wrong. Ethan had found a hidden vantage point and was watching them closely, waiting to see exactly what they planned to do next. Ethan watched as they split up, and after a few minutes, he quietly followed the path Mason had taken. He noticed the hunter was sticking to a well-worn game trail, assuming Ethan would have used it to move faster. But instead, Ethan looped around Mason, positioning himself a couple 100 yards ahead. The snow was starting to come down heavier now, though it wasn't quite sticking to the ground yet, except in the open areas. Ethan stayed under the trees as much as possible to avoid leaving any tracks. Ahead, he spotted an 8-foot-tall rotted tree stump beside the trail. The dead tree was hollow, with only one opening leading inside. Ethan unsheathed his hunting knife and stepped into the hollow stump, positioning himself to wait for Mason's approach. Mason moved cautiously, his rifle held ready in front of him. He was prepared to fire the moment he caught sight of his prey. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound behind him and spun around. But before he could fully turn, strong arms wrapped around his neck, and the cold edge of a knife pressed against his throat. He tried to struggle, but Ethan easily overpowered him, shaking him like a rag doll. Stay really quiet if you want to live, Ethan commanded in a low, dangerous voice. Drop your rifle and kick it away. Mason hesitated for a moment, feeling the blade slide lightly across his neck, leaving a shallow cut that began to bleed immediately. Do what I say, or I'll finish the job, Ethan warned. Reluctantly, Mason obeyed, letting the rifle fall from his hands and kicking it out of reach. Ethan swiftly kicked the back of Mason's knee, forcing him to the ground. Mason landed face first on the wet, leaf-covered earth, and Ethan quickly pulled his arms behind him, securing them with a zip tie from his hunting pouch. He repeated the process with Mason's feet, binding them together with another zip tie. Then, Ethan bent Mason's legs up, connecting his arms and legs with a third tie, effectively hog-tying him. That should hold you, Ethan remarked. He cut 2 strips from Mason's jacket, shoving one into his mouth and using the other to tie the gag in place. Don't go anywhere, I'll be back for you, Ethan added with a cold pat on the man's shoulder. He picked up Mason's rifle and hid it well off the trail, not wanting to use it since the sound would alert the others. Ethan moved on, heading east, listening to the light breeze rustling through the woods, more noise than his own quiet steps. Meanwhile, Frank had stopped to catch his breath. The hill he had just climbed was steep, filled with underbrush and fallen trees. He brushed off a moss-covered log and sat down, pulling out a cigarette. As he brought the lighter to the cigarette, he felt a sharp point press against the back of his neck. Slowly, he turned his head to find Ethan standing behind him, a hunting arrow aimed right at his face. "Drop the rifle," Ethan said quietly. Frank did as he was told, and Ethan shoved him face down onto the ground. He quickly tied Frank's hands, feet, and mouth just like he had done to Mason. After hiding Frank's rifle, Ethan muttered, "Now to find your friend." Just then, a rifle shot rang out, and Ethan barely had time to react before the bullet hissed past his head. Instinctively, he spun around, bringing his bow up in one swift motion and releasing the hunting arrow in one fluid movement. The carbon graphite arrow, fitted with a razor-sharp broadhead tip, sliced through the air, covering the 40-foot distance in less than a second. The arrow struck Mason squarely below the breastbone, the force of the impact driving him to his knees. The broadhead had pierced through his spine, leaving the arrow's shaft protruding from his back. Mason looked down at the arrow sticking out of him, then raised his eyes to Ethan one last time, offering a mocking salute before collapsing to the ground. "No need to tie this one," Ethan muttered, already moving like a ghost through the trees, disappearing into the woods on his way back to the farmhouse. Ethan slipped onto the back porch, peering cautiously through the window. Tom was at the kitchen table again, but this time he had his back to the wall, nervously gripping his pistol, which was braced on the table. His eyes darted between the front door and the back, waiting for any sign of movement. Standing just to the side of the door, Ethan knocked. Inside, he saw Tom jump up, his pistol immediately pointed at the back door. "Tom, it's Ethan," Ethan called out calmly. "Baylor, Mason, and Frank are tied up on the ridge. Mason wasn't so lucky. He's up there too, but I had to take care of him. I've got the girl." Tom's voice shook as he shouted back, his tone rising in fear. "If you hurt her, I swear I'll make you regret it." Ethan's voice was firm. "Leave the pistol and come outside, Tom. I give you my word, I won't hurt you." "What are you gonna do to me?" Tom asked, fear creeping into his voice. "I'll take you, Frank, and Mason to the sheriff," Ethan replied, pausing for a moment. "Come on, Tom. You can't hold out forever. You've got to sleep sometime." Tom hesitated. "That's true," he muttered, "but you'll never know when I sleep. All I've got to do is check on you every now and then." Tom glanced toward the front door, clearly considering his options. But if Mason and the others had been caught by this guy, he realized, there was no chance he'd make it out alone. Sighing in defeat, he placed the pistol on the table, stepped away, and lay down on the floor. Before Tom could even call out, Ethan came through the door, his bow drawn and an arrow ready. Seeing Tom surrender, Ethan let the string relax and tucked the arrow back into his quiver. He picked up the pistol from the table and slid it into his waistband. Then he headed to the pantry and grabbed 3 more zip ties, having used up his others on Mason and Frank. Ethan placed a knee on Tom's back and bound his hands and feet just like the others. With Tom secured, Ethan moved over to Samantha. Using his buck knife, he carefully cut the ropes that had been holding her and helped her sit up. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Samantha nodded, rubbing her wrists and stretching her legs to get the circulation back. "What about the others?" she asked. "Like I told Tom, 2 of them are hogtied in the woods," Ethan replied with a grim smile. "I had to deal with Mason." "Good," Samantha spat. "That scum got exactly what he deserved." Ethan took a closer look at Samantha. The left side of her face was still bruised from earlier, and the right side was swollen, with a small cut just above her eyebrow. The ugly mix of colors showed the force of the blows she'd endured. "Let me get a cold towel for your face," Ethan suggested, heading to the kitchen sink. As Ethan walked away, Samantha stood, limping slightly as she made her way over to where Tom lay bound on the floor. Without warning, she drew back her foot and kicked him 3 times, hard. "How does that feel, huh?" she snarled. "You thought you could use me, didn't you?" She lifted her foot to kick him again, but Ethan quickly wrapped his arms around her and pulled her back. "Take it easy, young lady," he said with a laugh. "I thought I was supposed to be the deadly hunter around here." "I'm just so angry," Samantha fumed. "All he and the others talked about was what they were planning to do to me." Samantha leaned into Ethan's arms, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. "We can't call the sheriff. We don't have a landline, and you're the one who insists we don't need one. Our cell phones don't get reception out here either." "We'll take the truck and head into Van Buren," Ethan said. "We'll tell the sheriff everything, and he can come back with us to pick up the trash." He grinned, adding, "And as far as a landline goes, you know it'd cost a fortune to get one this far out. Even if we could, I didn't move here to stay connected to civilization. I like having electricity, but that's about as modern as I'm willing to go." Samantha nodded. "All right, let's get going." Before they left, Ethan wrapped some ice cubes in a towel and handed it to Samantha to press against her swollen face. When they pulled into town, Sheriff Luke Bradley greeted them with a wave. "Howdy, Ethan." "Hey, Samantha. What brings you two to town today? It's not your usual day for a supply run." But when the sheriff got a closer look at Samantha, his expression changed instantly. "What happened to your face?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. "You'd better get over to see Doc Taylor." Sheriff Bradley knew just about everything that went on in his town, and seeing a young woman he considered a friend hurt like this clearly upset him. Sheriff Luke Bradley had been serving the community for over 15 years, first elected when he was just 25. He was so popular that, after a few terms, no one even bothered running against him in the elections. He didn't fit the image of a typical country sheriff. Standing over 6 feet tall with a lean, muscular build, his graying hair added just a touch of age to his otherwise youthful appearance. But it was his eyes that stood out, sharp, piercing, and unflinching. One look into those eyes, and you knew this was not a man to mess with. "We had some trouble out at the farm," Ethan began, explaining the situation while Samantha added details here and there. "3 of the 4 men are tied up back at the house." Bradley, ever attentive, asked, "You said 4 men. Where's the 4th?" Ethan's expression turned serious. "He shot at me, so I had to deal with him. He's up on the ridge." Bradley nodded, unfazed. "Sounds like they picked the wrong man to hunt," he said, his voice carrying a mix of approval and understanding. "Get Samantha over to Doc Taylor when you're ready. My deputy and I will follow you back to the farm." At Doc Taylor's office, there wasn't much that could be done for Samantha's bruises. The doctor carefully cleaned the cut on her face and closed it with a butterfly bandage. "It won't leave a scar, so don't worry about that," he reassured her. "Here are some painkillers if it starts hurting. Keep using that cold compress, you're going to look like a raccoon for a while." Back at the farm, Ethan and Samantha ignored Tom, still hogtied on the living room floor, as they made and ate lunch. Neither of them had eaten since the chaos had started earlier that day. "Hey, don't I get something to eat?" Tom called out in a whining tone. Ethan shot him a hard look. "No, you don't. You're lucky to still be breathing. Now shut up until the sheriff gets here." After lunch, Ethan went into the master bedroom and opened the hidden door inside the large closet, revealing a gun safe. He carefully cleaned and unstrung his bow, placing it in its holder. Then he retrieved his personal firearm, a Glock 21.45 caliber pistol, and holstered it beneath his rainproof jacket. He also put on a wide-brimmed waterproof hat before heading to the back door. "I'm going to bring Frank and Mason down for the sheriff," Ethan explained. "I'll go with you," Samantha offered, but Ethan shook his head. He handed her Tom's 9mm and pointed toward their prisoner. "Keep an eye on him. If Bradley shows up before I get back, let him know what's going on. I'll bring down the other 2 soon." "You be careful," Samantha warned, her voice full of concern. I don't want anything to happen to you. Ethan smiled, pulling her in for a quick hug before stepping outside. He hiked back up the ridge to where he'd left Mason, who was now lying on his side, soaked through from the rain and snow, shivering in the cold. Without a word, Ethan cut the zip tie connecting Mason's hands to his feet and freed his legs, but left his wrists bound. Pulling his coat aside, Ethan revealed the Glock holstered at his hip. "You're going to walk down the hill in front of me," Ethan instructed. "If you try anything or make a run for it, I'll shoot you and leave you here. Got it?" Mason, visibly shaken, nodded quickly. "Yes." "Say it," Ethan demanded. "I understand," Mason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned him around and the two made their way slowly back to the farmhouse, Ethan keeping a watchful eye on his prisoner the whole time. When they reached the porch, Ethan called out, "It's me, Samantha," before opening the door. He guided Mason inside, pulling him by the arm, and directed him to sit on the floor next to Tom. "Sit down," Ethan ordered, watching as Mason awkwardly lowered himself to the floor. Ethan went to the pantry and grabbed more zip ties. "Stick your feet out in front of you," he said. Mason complied, and Ethan quickly tied his feet together before pushing him back against the wall. Tom, his voice filled with frustration, whined, "What about me? Why do I have to stay tied up like this while he gets to sit normally?" Ethan pulled out his hunting knife, flipped Tom onto his stomach, and sliced through the zip tie that connected his hands and feet. "That's as much consideration as you're getting. Don't push your luck," he warned. Turning to Samantha, he asked, "You okay?" Samantha nodded, though she winced a little from the pain where Tom had struck her. "I'm going to go bring Frank in. I'll be back in about an hour," Ethan said. Then, with a stern glance at Tom, he added, "If they get any ideas, shoot him." Ethan left through the back door, following the game trail that led to the left of the house. When he reached Frank, the man had rolled against the log where he'd been sitting, his hat missing, and his hair plastered down by the wet snow. Ethan pushed Frank onto his stomach and cut two of the zip ties, leaving his hands bound behind his back. He helped Frank to his feet, showed him the Glock tucked at his side, and pointed down the trail. "If you try anything other than walking straight down that trail, I'll shoot you," Ethan said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Where are you taking me?" Frank asked, his voice shaky. "Back to the house. You'll join your friends. The sheriff should be there by the time we get back," Ethan replied. As they made their way down the muddy trail, Frank slipped and fell. "Careful now," Ethan said dryly, helping him back up. "Wouldn't want you getting hurt." As they approached the house, a large white van came into view, parked out front. "Looks like your ride's here," Ethan said, guiding Frank inside and pushing him to the floor beside Mason and Tom. Sheriff Bradley was waiting inside. "You didn't bring the fourth man's body down with you?" he asked, his tone half question, half observation. "Nope," Ethan replied. "He's still up on the ridge, just off the game trail." Bradley nodded. "He ought to be buried," he suggested. Ethan shrugged. "If you want him, feel free to go get him. If not, well, the varmints have to eat too." Taking the cup of coffee Samantha handed him, Ethan paused before turning back to Bradley. "On second thought, I don't want his body on my property. Loan me a deputy and I'll take the ATV up there to bring it down. We're going to need a body bag, though, he might be getting a bit ripe by now." Bradley considered for a moment. "Just give my boys directions and let them take the ATV. They'll bring him down," he said. "In the meantime, give me a hand getting these three loaded into the van." Together, Ethan and Sheriff Bradley began freeing the men's feet one at a time, though they left their hands bound. They guided Tom, Mason, and Frank out to the large Ford cargo van. There was only one bench seat across the front of the vehicle, and behind that, several tie-down points designed for securing cargo. Bradley cuffed each man's hands in front of them before cutting the zip ties. Then he used more zip ties to secure each man to different rings inside the van, leaving them to sit on the floor as best they could. "I can't ride like this," Mason complained, his voice filled with frustration. Bradley shot him a look. "I could hog-tie you again and just toss you in the back if you prefer." Mason wisely kept quiet after that. "Where'd you get the van?" Ethan asked as they stepped outside. "I didn't think Van Buren had more than 2 or 3 patrol cars." "We don't," Bradley replied with a grin. "After I talked to you, I went down to the U-Haul place and rented this cargo van." Comfort wasn't exactly a priority for this bunch. Not long after, the 2 deputies came back down the hill, the body secured on the front rack of the ATV. It had been zipped up in a body bag, and they had removed the arrow because they couldn't close the bag with it sticking out. The arrow had been saved, tucked away in the back of the van. They pulled up behind the van, opened the rear doors, and hefted the body inside. "We need to make sure the body's secure," Ethan advised, "so it doesn't shift around on the drive back to town." After securing the body, Ethan told them he'd return the ATV to the barn. The deputies climbed into the cab of the van, bickering over who got to ride shotgun. Sheriff Bradley strolled over to where Ethan sat on the ATV. "Glad you and Samantha are okay, Ethan," Sheriff Bradley said, shaking Ethan's hand firmly. He started to walk away but paused, turning back to Ethan with a curious look. "Got a question for you, though," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "Those men, they didn't stand a chance of catching you out in the woods. You moved through there like a ghost. You could have led them around those hills until their boots wore out." Ethan smiled slightly, nodding in agreement. "I know you stayed because of Samantha," Bradley continued, his tone shifting, "but that's what's got me wondering." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Wondering what, Sheriff?" "You stalked those men, got the drop on 2 of them, and they didn't even know you were there," Bradley said, studying Ethan carefully. "So why didn't you kill all of them? I know you've got the guts for it. Why didn't you end it right there?" Ethan shifted his weight, swinging his right leg across the ATV's tank. He stared out across the valley, his eyes fixed on the tree line in the distance. For nearly 10 seconds, he sat in silence, as if lost in thought. Then, turning back to Bradley, he answered quietly, "I'm a hunter, Sheriff, not an executioner."